I don't know what's going to happen after I come on your podcast. I don't know how long it's going to be until the episode comes out. Sometimes I do. Sometimes they say. Other times I don't know. I don't know how many listeners you have, because you can tell me a number, but it doesn't mean it's true. But I do know I have the opportunity to connect with one person, and then something might happen. Podcast Growth Nation, welcome back to another episode of Podcast Growth University, where we talk all things podcasting all the time. I hope you enjoyed last week's episode number 119, Vanity Metrics, what are they and why do they matter? Today, for episode number 120, the top 3 lessons from guesting on over 900 other podcasts. My goodness. So, guesting on other podcasts is drastically different than I expected. I think everything is. I think expectation versus reality is kind of the name of the game for everything. Is anything ever the way you expect it? You expect a movie to be a certain way, a restaurant to be a certain way, a song to be a certain way, and it never really is. But I've realized a lot, and I've learned a lot of lessons, great lessons, not so great lessons. I guess all lessons are good if you use them correctly. And I want to share them with you because I realize that most people don't have the time or the resources to be able to go on 900 other podcasts. I mean, that's a lot, right? Over the course of 7 years, but really over the course of maybe the last 3 to 4 years, that's happened. So let's just get right into it because that's what we like to do. One of the other reasons I want to do this episode, because I'm always talking about the importance of being on other podcasts. That's something you're going to hear me say. Will that ever shift? Maybe. I don't know. But for now, that's one of the best ways to grow your show, to network, to meet people. You never know. You never know what can happen. All right. The number one lesson that I have learned over 900 podcast guest opportunities. The best ways to research the shows that you're going to go on. So a couple things. One, it's very, very important to research the shows you're going to go on. That's one lesson. Not just because you want to know who you're talking to, but there is something that happens when somebody says, hey, do you know what the show is about? And you say, yeah, I know it's called this, and I know, judging from your branding and your marketing and your content, your guests, your audience is this, and this is usually the direction your episodes go, and this is kind of the why behind the podcast. When you show up as a guest and you know all of that, that already sets you apart. You're already in a different bucket of somebody who just shows up and doesn't know the name of the host. If you know the host's name and you can start with that, you're already building rapport, and that's going to go a long way. So that's one thing, is do research before you go on a podcast. I cannot tell you how many times I have known more about that person and their podcast than they knew about me. Again, I'm not making that wrong. Some people don't want to do research, and that's totally fine. I feel the responsibility to do the research because I want to make sure that, number one, this is an aligned show, and number two, I know who I'm talking to. That's very, very important to me. So the best ways to research from what I've seen. Number one, obviously the podcast, right? That's the best place. When I'm looking at a podcast, I'm looking at how many episodes they've done. I'm looking at how often they miss episodes. So, okay, they did every 7 days, and then they missed a month, and then they only posted 2 the next month. I'm looking at that stuff because there's a lot of hints and lessons in that. I'm looking at how many reviews they have. We'll get into that. I'm looking at the audio quality. I'm looking at the video quality. I'm looking at the name of the podcast. I'm looking at all of that stuff. How's the intro? How's the outro? Is there one? Is there video on YouTube? Is there not video on YouTube? I'm looking at all that stuff just because I want to get an idea of what I'm in for. I want to know what I should be expecting. So that's all podcast stuff. I always look at social media. Whatever social media that is, whatever social media I can find. If somebody's only on LinkedIn, that is a suggestion of the type of audience that they have. If they don't have any social media, okay, I am assuming that podcast isn't doing very well. So a lot of the thoughts are based on what I have done to grow my show, and I've seen work for so many other people. What are these people doing? Because there's another thought where, for me, I want to get as good as humanly possible at podcasting. So I'll go on shows that maybe other people wouldn't. Maybe this person hasn't been super consistent and they're all over the place. I'm okay with that because for me, it's getting good first. Mastery, impact, profitability. Mastery, getting really good. Impact, adding value to whatever audience there is. Profitability, maybe something profitable comes from it. But it's mastery, impact, profitability. I understand for you, if you're going to do one podcast episode as a guest per week, you're going to be more choosy. You're not going to want to be on a show that is not going to exist in 6 months. It won't make sense. It's more of a waste of your time because if the show doesn't exist, you're not going to get exposure, and depending on what your goal is, you're not going to accomplish that. So that's one of the important things about researching. I want to know whether or not this person is going to be around in the future, and that might matter more to you than it does to me because for me, I'm really focused on mastery. So social media is always something I'm looking at. I look at the reviews. I kind of mentioned that. We'll talk about that. We'll dive a little bit deeper. And then I look at the website. If the person has a website, it can help you understand what the goal of the podcast is. So if somebody has a website, if somebody has a podcast that's about business and they have a website and the way they monetize their podcast is through getting clients for marketing, I go in understanding that, okay, this person might try to sell me on something. That's okay. I'm not saying that's wrong. That's part of their business model. That's how they do it. But I just want the awareness. I want to make sure that I'm aware of that so I don't get blindsided by that. Because it's probably not aligned to work with this person, but that's okay. I'm happy to hear them out, happy to communicate with them, but I just want to know. I want to know. So let's dive into 2, because 2 really connects to 1. There's a lot of red flags when I'm doing research. So if I look at somebody's website and it's abundantly clear that the only reason they have the podcast is to try to get guests as clients, I still might go on, but I'm just way more hesitant. Because for them, it's not mastery, impact, profitability, it's profitability first. And again, I'm not making that wrong. It just might be a misalignment. Really good example of this. I was supposed to go on a podcast, and I did a podcast pre-call with this person, and we were talking back and forth, and he said, honestly, I don't even care about the audience. I have this podcast so I can connect with people like you, and then we can collaborate and see what type of business we can do together. I did not go on that podcast. Not interested. My understanding, my thought process is if you don't care about the audience, you're probably not doing anything to grow the audience. So I don't want to just come on and not impact anybody, especially if the mastery around it isn't going to be that high. It's not going to be, I can't imagine it's going to be a great interview if the only focus is how do we work together after. So that for me is a red flag. When somebody says, I don't care about the audience, the only reason I have this podcast is to grow my business, that is a potentially dangerous thing because they're probably not doing a lot of research. They're probably not doing things that are helping them to go above and beyond. They're probably not creating really good content. They're probably not doing any of those things. So that might not be a valuable use of your time. So that's a red flag for me. That's one. One of the reasons I look at social media is because I have had the opportunity to go on a few podcasts that brand themselves, and that's in quotes for those just listening, as big, very successful podcasts. And the reason they say they're big and very successful is because they have 250,000 Instagram followers. Those followers are all fake, and that's why I do research. Because when I land on somebody's profile and they have 250,000 followers and they don't have any comments and no engagement, that's obvious. Or if every single one of their posts has a similar amount of likes, the 250, 247, 254, and they all have a very similar amount of comments, and they're just one-word comments or they're hearts and emojis, that is a suggestion of potential paying for engagement. And this is way more common than you would probably imagine, especially if you're somebody who maybe you're newer to social media because the podcast has pushed you into social media world. It is the Wild West out there. That's another suggestion that, okay, you're paying for followers, you're paying for engagement. That means your podcast couldn't possibly be doing that well. That's like paying for people or paying for reviews on your book and then saying, yeah, I'm a very, very successful author. Cool, you've paid people or you've bought reviews, but that doesn't mean you have a community. It doesn't mean anybody has read your book. It doesn't mean anything. It just means that you're playing the vanity metric game. It doesn't mean anything behind the scenes. Usually it means the opposite. If you're paying for followers, it's because you can't figure out how to get a social media following engaged. If you're paying for reviews on your podcast, which is more common than you might think, and we'll dive into that, that to me is a suggestion that you can't get reviews, which means you probably don't have that big of an audience, or you don't have an engaged audience, or you just don't care about it. I was supposed to go on a podcast one time, and I was doing research. That's what this episode's about, essentially. And one of the things I looked at was the reviews. And they had 550 5-star reviews, no negative reviews, no 4-star reviews, 3-star, 2-star, 1-star. None. All 5 stars. Immediately, that is a red flag to me. Because you go on Amazon and you find the best product that they have, there are still 4, 3, 2, and 1-star reviews. Even if it's 99% 5-star, there are still other ones. Just because that's the way it works. So I said, okay, let me take a look. What's going on here? So I start reading the reviews, and it is abundantly clear that these are not real. Some of the reviews had the wrong host's name in it. It was just, this podcast is awesome. John is a really good host, when it wasn't hosted by John, it was hosted by somebody else. It was just abundantly clear that these were not real. Did not end up going on that show. I'm not telling you not to. I'm not saying it's not worth it. It's just, it's not aligned because I can't imagine the person's really good at the craft of podcasting. They have an audience that I'm actually going to be able to impact. And really, those are the main two. Even if I did have the opportunity to work with that person, I don't know if I would. I tell my clients all the time, do not pay for stuff. Do not pay for listens. Do not pay for reviews. It's going to sabotage you in the long run. It's really hard to win that way. I had a client who had somebody help him with promotion, and he went from having, I don't know, a couple thousand downloads a month to having 50,000 downloads for a month or two. And then when he stopped paying, it went down as it would, and now the data is all skewed. Now we don't have any good data. No idea what is real and what is not real anymore. I'm not saying the person wrecked their podcast forever, but it's going to take a while to recover from that, unfortunately. So that was against my advice. But again, everybody wants to try out their own thing, and no worries on that. But that's a red flag. It's a red flag because it most likely is not going to be worth your time. I think another red flag is, and this is a fine line, shows that require payment. Now, I'm on the fence about this because I have clients who have enough listens where when somebody reaches out to them, they say, hey, thank you so much for the interest, and they have their own verbiage. This isn't it. But hey, thank you so very much for the interest on being on the podcast. All of the people that reach out to me who want to be on, there is a guest fee for production and social media clips and all that stuff. It's whatever it is, $97, $147, whatever it is. That's because they have enough demand where people are reaching out to them consistently, and they also have enough listens. If you are getting 10,000 listens a month, it might be worth paying $97 to come on, hypothetically. So I'm not saying this is something not to do. I'm not saying this is a red flag. Maybe this is a yellow flag. When it crosses from a yellow flag to a red flag is when there's like an entire sales presentation about why you should be on and why you should pay. This happened to me last week. Very sweet human, seems like they're doing really good in the world. I love it. But they're on a quote-unquote TV network, and supposedly there's 7 million subscribers. I do not believe that for a second. 7 million subscribers is a lot of subscribers for anything. Never mind a TV network it just seems like a stretch. It just seems like a very, very, very big stretch. And there was an entire 35-minute sales presentation about, okay, this is this, and we have reviews, and these are the people, and this is our Facebook page, and look at all these likes that we have. And then we get to the end, and they say, so we do have a fee associated with being on the show. For me, that's not aligned, because I would never charge anybody to be on our show, and we have a big show. I just don't want to do it that way. I'm not saying you can't do that as a business model. That's just not the approach that I want to take. And for me, paying $500 to be on your show when I don't believe your audience is the size it is misaligned. If they showed me a graph of, okay, this is this month and this month and this month and this month and all that stuff, this is how many views this episode actually got, that might be a different story. But it was all kind of cloaked in secrecy. That to me is a red flag. The cloaked in secrecy is red flag. Anybody who exaggerates their numbers, that is a red flag. When you're on Podmatch or Matchmaker, it usually says, I think it says like maybe monthly reach or monthly downloads or whatever it is. I think a lot of people are stretching the truth on that. Just based on the fact that I have talked to many of them behind the scenes, and the numbers they tell me don't necessarily line up with the numbers that are on their profile. Again, you're erring on the side of perception. But anytime there's a stretch in that, that to me is a red flag. Because it's just a suggestion that if you're lying about that, what else are you lying about? Okay, that's my thought on that. Okay. The third one, and I'll probably dive back into the other ones because those are the things I think that fire me up the most. But we'll go to the third one. The third one might be kind of a surprise. The power of storytelling. So I thought that I was going to have to get to the point where I knew everything and I never made a mistake when I spoke and I had an answer to every question. And I've realized that a lot of people, a lot of the amazing opportunities I've had to be interviewed are because people want to hear my story. And I've had the opportunity to tell my story 1,000 times probably by now, between being on all these podcasts, coaching calls, speeches, all that stuff. Oh, probably 1,000 times. And I'm realizing that that's something that a lot of people are interested in doing. A lot of people are interested in having you on because you have an amazing story. So don't ever fall into the trap of thinking that your story doesn't matter, your story is not powerful, it's not important, it's not going to move the audience, whatever it may be. That's a big surprise to me. A lot of people, I'll get on the meeting and say, hey, nice to meet you. Hey, Bob, nice to meet you. Hey, Kev, nice to meet you. Awesome. When I saw your profile and I saw your story, I really, really wanted to interview you because I feel like that's something that a lot of people deal with, and then it just kind of goes from there. That is something that's super surprising to me. I think the story matters more than I ever realized. So I'm willing to bet that maybe your story matters more than you realize, unless you're already hyper-focused on your story. But that's something that was a surprise to me that I wanted to throw in. Most of the time, I'm telling my story, especially on shows that are about mindset, peak performance, transformation, that type of stuff. Maybe business shows, not as much, but even then, that happens pretty often. So that was an interesting number 3 for me that I didn't expect. So I would say those are kind of the top 3. Let's see. The other, an easy lesson is the podcast community is pretty small, all things considered. It's relatively small.
Hi, my name's John Laredo, and I just wanted to give a big shout out to Kevin Palmieri. I had reached out to him. He had been referred to me when I had shared with a friend of mine some interest in doing a podcast, and he said, you've got to use Kevin. He's fantastic. He's the best around. He'll get you started and off the ground and soaring high. Kevin was phenomenal in terms of leading me through the whole process, and not just easy to work with, but really, really knows his stuff. So whether you're looking for somebody to help you and get you started, or somebody, as I've done, where I'm putting it entirely in his hands because I've got total trust and confidence in him, any of those ends of the spectrum, you're going to have a lot of success and a lot of fun working with Kevin. Trust me. Thanks.
Everybody kind of knows everybody. When I'm doing research, I see shows that have had guests that I've been on, and it's just this kind of, it's not as big as you think. The podcast space is not as big as you might think it is. I know a lot of people say it's saturated and all that. It's probably not as saturated as you think. So that's another lesson, is everybody kind of knows everybody. And I think that's why it's so important to make sure that you're positive and make sure that you're a good person, and not trying to take advantage of people, which is that's always a red flag for me. So that's something I would throw in there. This is one that makes me sad. I have a list of all the podcasts that I've been on, and oftentimes I'll go through and I'll look at the list and say, oh, I haven't talked to Chris in a long time. Let me see how Chris is doing. And then I go look to see, and Chris no longer has the podcast. If you can be consistent and you can keep going, you are already more successful than most podcasters, because most people don't make it past 7 episodes, 20 episodes. If you're at 100 or 200, you are way, 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 way ahead of the curve. Now, just because you have consistency does not mean you have strategy, but hopefully you're improving your strategy as you go. That's something that has made me sad. I've had the opportunity to be on so many podcasts, but the vast majority of these probably are no longer in production. The vast majority of these shows, I would say at least half. I would have to go through the whole list, but I would say if I went through the whole list of 900 podcasts, I would say roughly half of those probably are no longer in production. That sucks. That makes me sad, for sure, because that's what this podcast is about, you not being that statistic. So that is something that is very surprising to me, but I guess it makes sense now when you look at it and you look at the stats. So that's something that jumps off the page. This is one that I've talked about before, but I just want to reiterate. If you're a host and guests are not sharing the content you're creating, I'm willing to bet the content just isn't that great yet. I was on a podcast recently. They tagged me in the stuff. I always share it to my story. But it's just a still frame picture of me and the host with the title of the episode. That's not going to do anything. It's just, that's not enough to move the needle. If you look, so my handle is @NeverQuitKid on Instagram. If you look at the collaboration posts that are on my feed, almost all videos. They're usually really good videos that other people create. And it's like, all right, cool. This makes sense for my profile. This makes sense for my audience. It's valuable. But if it's just a picture of me with the title of the episode, that's not going to do anything. It's not that I don't want to share it. I always share it to my story. I just know that it's not going to make that big of a difference. It's just not enough emotion. There's just not enough necessity to listen to the episode. Now, I understand maybe you're not at a place where you can create high-quality video yet. I would much rather somebody take their cell phone and say, hey, so let's say I had a guest on, right? I had a guest on, and I'm not at the stage yet where I can create really high-quality video content, but I want to make sure that you are reminded and inspired by today's episode. Hey, Podcast Growth Nation, what's happening? Have you ever felt like growing your podcast is impossible? I know. We've all been there. We've all experienced that in some way, shape, or form. I have an interview dropping today with Blank, and they talk about their 3-step system to help you grow your podcast. And I know what you're thinking. It can't be that easy. Trust me, this episode is something that I learned, or this episode is a place where I learned a ton of stuff too. So make sure you click the link below, jump into the episode, and then bring your notebook because you're going to learn a ton. Again, that's off the top of my head. But I would rather you record that video and then tag the guest because they're more likely to share that than they are a still frame picture. So the creativity around the content is something that I'm just seeing. One of the reasons a lot of shows don't grow is because they have guests on, and then when they create the content for the guests to share, it's just not shareable. It's just not good. And even if they do share it, almost nothing is going to come from it. Where, okay, you can't do video, maybe you're not on YouTube, no worries. Take your cell phone, record a video, tag the guest, bada bing, bada boom, maybe they'll share it, make it a collaborative post on Instagram, awesome. The likelihood of them sharing it is higher. Will they? No, some people won't. All right, some people are all over the place, and they won't. And other people, maybe they're just selfish and they won't. If I haven't shared a piece of content, it's usually because it just isn't very good. I'll always share it on my story. But that's the other thing too, is somebody says, okay, go to this Google Drive folder and download all these, and then I'll send you the verbiage and you can put the verbiage in. You got to make the resistance as low as humanly possible for it to share. And the best way to do that is to make a post about it, tag the person in the post, and then they can share it, or do a collaborative post where they can share it, at least on Instagram, right? Those are the best two ways. You can tag people on every platform. I think the collaboration is probably Instagram only right now. I think that's kind of the best way to do it. But if you're not getting shares, that's probably one of the reasons why. Maybe the content isn't high enough quality. Try something else. Try video if you haven't, and you can. If you can't do video, it's out of the realm of possibility. Record a video on your phone. Boom, off to the races. I've seen people that literally screen capture the interview they screen cap the Zoom, and then they cut that up in some way, and then they share that. Whatever the improvement is, I think that's the next step. That's the next step. The next step. We have to think about it from a couple different avenues. What's in it for you when you have a guest on, and then what's in it for the guest? The guest is most likely looking for an audience. They're looking for eyes. They're looking for impact. Profitability is common. That's why people do book tours. When they have a book out, they go on all the podcasts. But afterwards, I don't think it's always negative where somebody says, oh, I don't want to share this content, or this interview sucked, or I'm just selfish. I think oftentimes they see the content and say, this isn't going to do anything. I can't share that. It's going to make my profile look bad, or it's going to make my profile look worse, or whatever it is. I think that's a conscious thought for people. So I just want to throw that out there. There's another thing I had. Oh, this is the other thing. There are a lot of people that are just all over the place. And again, I am wildly disorganized compared to where I need to be. I'm way more organized than I used to be, so I'm making progress in the right direction. But I can't tell you how many no-shows I've had, how many times I've emailed someone and said, hey, ready to go, can you send the link? And they just haven't, and then I never heard from them again. That is very, very common. So don't be surprised if when you do start doing interviews, you start to see how disorganized other people are. Again, I'm not making that wrong. That's just something that has been a lesson for me. That's just been a very, very interesting lesson. So I want to throw that out there. And then this would be the last one. The last lesson is it matters way more than I thought in terms of some results, and it matters way less than I thought in terms of other results. So in terms of it mattering way more, I've had the opportunity to talk to so many podcasters. I've had the opportunity to end up coaching many of the podcasters, which is awesome. I get to learn about the struggles of podcasters, because eventually what happened is I would go on a show and somebody would say, hey, we'd get to the end of the interview and they say, hey, can I ask you a couple questions about podcasting? I was like, yeah, of course. Ask whatever you got. And that might lead into them saying, okay, cool. What do you do? How do I work with you? Oh, this is what we do, and this is how much it is. And oh my goodness, okay, cool. That's super affordable. Let's do it. Awesome. Cool. Didn't realize that was going to happen as much as it did. That's awesome. That's usually what I advise clients to do. If you go on a podcast and you have something, try to add value in that direction and then see what happens, right? Maybe you offer somebody a call, a free session, you add value, and then they ask what it takes to work with you. Cool. That's a great direction. I would say listens from guesting on podcasts is less than I thought it would be. You got to think, right? How many listens are you getting per episode right now? Let's say it's 25. Okay. So if you're guesting on a podcast and it's getting 25 listens and 1% of that audience comes and listens to you, that's only 2.5 people. That's if it's 25. Now, if it's 100, okay, maybe it ends up being 10 people. But you can see how the size of the audience really dictates what type of audience you're going to be able to attract over to your stuff. That's less than I thought. Now, could be a lot of things, right? It could be a lot of different things. One, our podcast that I usually talk about it's a daily show, so that's a very specific audience. It's very niched, but also not niched enough at the same time because it's holistic self-improvement. That's something. There's 2 hosts. That's something. Alan and I are very different humans. That's something. There's a lot of things that could lead to, okay, maybe people check it out and it's not for them. So I'm not saying it won't happen for you. It depends. It depends on a lot of things. But on the other end, you know how many hosts I've met that end up coming into our community? You know how many hosts I've met that listen to Podcast Growth U now? A ton. One of the big lessons is you're going to have more opportunity probably with podcast hosts than podcast audiences. That's something that I've learned. Now, again, I know it's different, right? Kev, you're a podcast coach and all these people are podcasters. I understand. So maybe my results with that will be higher. But I've seen this across industries. I've seen this with business coaches. I've seen this with mindset coaches. I've seen this with fitness coaches. I've seen this with all sorts of different industries and expertises. Usually it's coaching, right? That's usually the way it works. But if you're a real estate agent or you're in the real estate market and you go on a podcast that has a host who might be interested in real estate stuff, that is an opportunity. That's the perspective that's surprising to me. This is a longer episode than I expected, but that's the perspective that's surprising to me is it doesn't really matter how many listeners the host has. There's an opportunity for impact right in front of you. And if you're looking to be profitable, that's an opportunity too. But when I'm on a podcast, this happened recently. I was on a podcast, great show, very aligned with our brand. Person reached out to ask me a question. I said, hey, we have group coaching coming up. Might be something you're interested in. This is it. Boom, 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 boom. And they said, oh my goodness, that's super aligned for me and what I'm looking to do. Awesome. That was a podcast host. I have no idea what is going to come from the audience. No clue. But it's an opportunity to meet people and then start conversations. Going back to something I've been saying since the very beginning, and I'll probably always say until we're robots, is the number of one-on-one conversations you're having is probably going to dictate your success with pretty high likelihood. If you're having one-on-one conversations all the time and you're creative with those conversations, there's business there, there's listeners there, there's impact there, there's opportunity there, there's collaboration there, right? So that's a perspective that I'm really starting to lean into is I don't know what's going to happen after I come on your podcast. I don't know how long it's going to be until the episode comes out. Sometimes I do. Sometimes they say. Other times I don't know. I don't know how many listeners you have because you can tell me a number, but it doesn't mean it's true. But I do know I have the opportunity to connect with one person and then something might happen. Something might happen. I was supposed to be a guest on a podcast like a year ago. And this person and I have been talking on and off and on and off and on and off. And we jumped on a call last week just to connect. And it ended up being a potential collaboration. They said, hey, do you do stuff like this that I'm looking to go in the direction of? And I said, yeah, we actually do. I've tried it before. This is what I've learned. Here are my tips. Here are my tricks. Here are my takeaways. And they said, all right, cool. I might want to work with you to kind of push this thing forward. I haven't even been on the podcast yet. But there is a person that I've been talking to. So maybe that might be the biggest lesson from all of this. Yes, research the show. Yes, research the host. Research the social media. Avoid red flags. Do all that. Use podcasts as an opportunity to tell your story. Going back to the mindset shift that helped me a ton and is still helping me, every one of these is practice. So it's just a great opportunity to get really good at speaking and storytelling and all that stuff. But maybe the biggest one is it might not be what you think it is in terms of I'm going to be on a show, and then I'm going to get a ton of new listeners to my podcast. You might get one new listener. It might be the host of the podcast. One listener, one community member is worth way more than you probably think. And when I say worth, I don't mean financially. I mean in the grand scheme of a community. There's a thing that you only need 1,000 raving fans. And again, I don't like fans. Even in Next Level University, we say we don't have fans, we have family. I don't like that word, the fan thing. It's weird. Even the follower thing is weird. I don't like that label necessarily. But one person One person is a potential like on all your social media stuff. It's a potential message every time you post something in your story. It's a potential comment or engagement in a Facebook group. It's a potential subscriber to an email list. It's a potential to somebody coming to a free live event that you're doing virtually. It's a potential client or customer. I think if we focused more on that stuff, then I think we probably have better results. But that's the unscalable stuff that a lot of people are looking to skip. That's genuinely where I've seen the most results. And then those results have given me opportunities to go get other results. So that's kind of my takeaway. When you're on other podcasts, yes, audience size is something to be aware of. And yeah, sure, if you have the opportunity to go on a podcast that has 100,000 listeners, awesome, do that. But there's always a host. And if you can align your message, and maybe you can align what you're good at and the results you have with what the host is looking to improve, that might be a community member right there. And that person might come listen to your podcast. And who knows what can happen from there. So those are my takeaways. What are we, 36 minutes in? My goodness. If you listen to the end of this, shout out to you. You're amazing. Also, if you ever have a question, and maybe you don't want to book a podcast breakthrough session, maybe you don't want to send me an email, whatever it is, if you're listening to this on Spotify, there is some sort of little thing you can write. I think it says ask a question or Q&A or what did you think of this episode? Feel free. I'm going to check that all the time. So feel free to let me know questions, comments, concerns. Spotify is starting to go the way of YouTube, where they're trying to create engagement and they're trying to use the platform for community, which I think is going to set Spotify apart. I thought Apple Podcasts was going to be the number one and stay number one. I don't think they are. I think Spotify is really, really going, and now they're creating opportunities for engagement and community, and they make it easy. So I think Spotify is really putting their pedal to the metal. But if you want to ask questions, that's always there on Spotify. It's not there on Apple. If you do want to ask a question on Apple, it should say send a text message, I think, on the top of the show notes. I can't message you back for whatever reason, but I can always answer the question on the podcast, or if you tell me where to find you, I can reach out to you there. So the podcast apps are getting better in terms of communication for community, but there is definitely still a delta. So that's always an option. If you do want to hop on a free 30-minute podcast breakthrough session where we can talk about all this stuff or help you strategize on how to make the most out of your guest appearances, we'll have the link in the show notes below. I hope you are getting on other podcasts. I hope the guests are improving. I hope the confidence is improving. I hope maybe the podcast thing doesn't seem as crazy as it once did. And I hope that your listens are increasing. And I hope your one-on-one conversations are increasing. Even if your listens aren't increasing and your one-on-one conversations are, you're probably winning more than you realize. All right. As always, until next week, keep on crushing it. Keep on podcasting. I'm grateful for all of you, genuinely. And we will talk to you all next week.